Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from or when you're watching. It is your girl, Marcy Thomas, the founder of Brown Girl Collective, and this lovely platform, the BGC Book Club. It is indeed an honor to be with you again, coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, with another great book by a Black woman writer. Now, if this is your first time with us, just to let you know, this is a space where we celebrate those stories that are by, for, and about us. And so if it is your first time, if you don't mind dropping in the comments that it's your first time, where you're joining us from, or even if you've been here before, just to let us know that you are a part of this community, and also that you can share comments or ask questions and all of that during this conversation. So I am really excited tonight about the book that we will be discussing, which is Coleman Hill by Kim Coleman Foote. So I can't wait to get into it. But before we do, let me just tell you a little bit about her. She was born and raised in New Jersey, where she started writing at the age of 7-ish. A recent fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, she has received additional fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, New York Foundation for the Arts, Breadloaf, Phillips Exeter Academy, Center for Fiction, and Fulbright, and residencies at Yale, McDowell, and Hedgebrook, among others. Her fiction and essays have appeared in numerous places, to include The Best American Short Stories, The Rumpus, and so much more. And Coleman Hill is her first novel that we have an opportunity to read and discuss, and I'm sure it won't be the last. So without any further delay, let's bring Kim Coleman Foote into the room. Welcome, Kim.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thanks, Marcy, for having me.
Oh, yes. Thank you for joining us. I am really excited to get into your story. So before we get into it, first of all, congratulations on your new book, baby.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, and you mentioned to me before we came on board, you birthed a couple babies this year, so it's been a busy time for you.
Yes.
Yes.
Indeed.
So what is it that drove you to want to write your family's story?
So I have been hearing these stories since I was a little girl, growing up here in Jersey, and it fascinated me because they talked about a whole different world from what I grew up in. The 1940s were so much different from the 1980s. But part of that was that they talked about their grandmother, my mother, and her sisters and her cousins, and she used to abuse them, basically. And they would sit around and laugh actually about it. And I'd be disturbed as a child, thinking, like, how could you laugh about some of those things that are happening? And then I started seeing like patterns in my family. I started noticing certain things that the adults didn't seem to be aware of. Like, they would say how like somebody got beat senselessly just because she looked like such and such. And then they turn around and say like, oh, I wonder why she's like that today. And I'm like, you can't see why she's like that.
Right.
So I've been wanting to explore these connections in my family for a long time and was fascinated by the history. Um, and then it wasn't until I was in my MFA program in Chicago that I had an assignment for a class to write a story based on a photograph. And I chose one of my grandfather's three sisters as little girls. And the one in the middle, like, literally spoke to me. Like, her voice just came to me. And she said, I ain't afraid of that man or his camera. And it took off from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love that. And like as you mentioned, of course, I probably won't find the exact picture, but that is one of the things in the book that you
27.
27. All right, thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
I know it by now.
Yes, as
And
you
it's not
do.
numbered. It's not numbered, but it is 27.
All right. Yes, but yep, there it is. I don't know how closely you all can see that, but yeah, it's a picture of three little girls. So, but in telling the story, of course, there is a specific way in which you told the story, which you got from one of our greats that we all love, Audre Lorde. So just explain, because it's fictionalized, but it also it's based on real things.
Yes. So Audre Lorde used the term biomythography for her memoir Zami, which I had also read during my MFA program, and I really loved it. And I was like, well, what is biomythography? Because it just, it read like a regular memoir. There was nothing like unusual. It wasn't speculative, anything like that. And so later I learned that she coined that term. She used it to define a work of literature that combines many sources to create a modern myth, a new history. And I realized that's what I was doing, because at some point I was like, well, what am I doing? Because I didn't really have examples of it. I mean, then I thought, I was like, oh yeah, Alex Haley did something like that. But, his was more epic, taking it all the way back to slavery with Kunta Kinte. But he also called what he was doing faction. And I was just like, I just don't like the sound of that. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, yeah.
Action has another meaning as well.
Exactly. So biomythography, I like that, and especially with her description, because I was taking the oral histories, I was taking my fiction. I'm also a genealogist for my family, so I was doing all the research, not for the book, because that's my hobby. So I was collecting all the census records and, birth records, et cetera, over the years, and combining all of those elements and the pictures, from my family and artifacts from my family, and building these narratives from them. And so that really resonated with me, that term.
Yes, yes. So we talked about this a little bit before we came on, but just the fact that you were, even with it being not all true per se, how did your family feel about you incorporating them or their stories into such an important work?
So far, so good. So I made the decision not to show anything to them before anything published. So excerpts from the novel have been getting published for a while now, for the past several years. And in fact, the first came out many, many years ago. And so my family, they've come to most of my readings that I've done, where I've presented parts of it. And I think, like, I always emphasize that it is fiction, because I did not live in the 1940s or before that, or even after that, for many decades. And so I can't necessarily even say what's true, myself, because it's hearsay. I heard this from relatives, because even with the stories that I heard, there are other people who are like, well, wait, I don't remember that happening. But that's the very thing that I wanted to interrogate with this book, is how memory works, right? And so I didn't want someone to come in and say, well, oh no, you shouldn't write about that, because that's not how I remembered it, or this is too painful, or this is too shameful to represent, because I think sometimes the things that we consider the most shameful are the most powerful, and there's lessons to be learned in those things. So, some traumas happen in my family. They recreated, through the generations. And I felt like it was important to explore that, especially because, like I said, as a little girl, I was seeing what these adults couldn't see, right? Because they were too close to it, right? Because I could clearly see, like, the pattern was there, and just like, getting older and seeing these things happen in other families as well, not just mine. And so I wanted to really, really try to get people to understand, like, okay, the roots of this trauma, that no one just springs up being evil or acting evilly out of nowhere, right? That came from somewhere. And especially for us as Black folks, a lot of that stuff came from slavery, our experience, our ancestors' experiences with slavery, and how we're still dealing with repercussions. We know it. We have so many elements today, all these police brutality and murders. It's not just, in the prison system, like, it's not accidental, right? So we know certain things, but there's certain things that we still carry on even within our families that we consider part of our culture and take pride in, but it's actually pretty disturbing once you look at it and realize that this came from, slavery.
Yes, and I, as I mentioned to you before we came on, I spent several days of the last week in Montgomery, Alabama, and had a chance to go to the Legacy Museum, which basically talks about us from enslavement to what we're dealing with now, which is mass incarceration. So what you just touched on is so much when we see the things that happen to our families and the ways that all of these things have impacted us and still, as you say, continue to impact us. Or to go to, the memorial where they show all the people who were lynched and you can see the names and all of that. So there is so much. And I know oftentimes people don't want to deal with the reality of that, but I think that those stories are important to tell because it shows a level of knowing where we came from, of course, but then also a level of resiliency that we have had as a people. So how important was it for you to tell that story and to include that element as well?
It was very important because, I say even in my author's note, I know that people are sick of hearing about Black trauma, right? Because it's been so popular these days, especially after George Floyd. And I make it clear I'm not writing this book to put anyone else in even more pain than they're already dealing with. My point, like I said, was to show those patterns, to show some of the dysfunctions that came out in our families as a result of slavery. I lost the question.
Okay, but how important was it for you to show the resilience?
Yes. Resilience, resistance, joy, love, all of that I felt was important to show because I'm not about just showing the trauma and just showing Black people as victims, right? Because once you put that label on someone, you're not human anymore, right? Right? Because I was just thinking the other day, like, there's one thing to be victimized, to have an experience where you're victimized, and there's another thing to be an actual victim, right? And we were victimized. Victim is not our sole definition of our entire life, right? Because if we're just victims, that means that we're just suffering and just in misery. And again, I'm not writing this book to like just live alongside this misery and be miserable and cry, and everything. So I wanted to represent like the full range of our humanity, so, and especially I think, there's a lot of movies and books, even now that have been put out about Black experiences. And some of it I feel like leans into trauma porn and poverty porn, because it only shows like that one perspective. And I think, it's important to show again to balance all these things because we're not just that one thing, right? We have other aspects of our lives that makes us human beings and not just like a stereotype or a caricature. So yeah, that's why it was important for me.
Yes. And for those who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, just like a synopsis of what people can expect when they dive in.
Sure. So it's a multi-voice narrative. It starts with my great grandmothers actually coming out of Alabama and Florida on their way to New Jersey, why they left the South. And it branches off from there. So I was fascinated also when I was doing my genealogical research. They came up to Jersey when they were like, I guess both were in their 20s, I think. And they had about 5 kids each when their husbands died, not that long after they got to Jersey. So both became widows relatively early after moving to this whole new place, raised these children alone. Both ended up owning their own homes on domestic salary. They never remarried, so I was just fascinated, like, what was that experience like? So it shows them coming up and their, trials and tribulations, their hopes for the North, for their children, especially. And then basically an incident happens between their children. So they're friends. An incident happens between their children that reverberates through the next 2 generations. So their friendship is shattered. And then, it complicates things for their grandchildren. And so you get to see lots of different family members talk about incidents that happen to them. There's also alcoholism that happens within the family. You get to see different family members, mention some of the same incidents, repeat them. And I did that intentionally just to show, again, how memory works, how different people perceive different events. And one example is how love is represented, so the character who was inspired by my grandmother, she grew up believing that in this kind of like, Hollywood
Mhm.
fairy tale version of love. But at the same time, she married my grandfather, who was very physically abusive towards her, which I didn't even find out until I was an adult
Wow.
about that story. But then his mother was also physically abusive to her. And she basically thought that love was pain. If a man hits you, then that means he loves you,
Right.
And so her sister comes in with the total opposite viewpoint. And she's like, well, I don't know what love is, but I know it's not pain. It shouldn't hurt.
Right.
Right. And so you get to see her kind of challenge that perspective.
And that is something that we often hear. People can grow up in the same household, same parents, same situation, and have two totally different experiences. Or it can also be that one will decide to follow the path that their parents took or the people who raised them took, and others will be like, oh no, I hated that, I'm not dealing with that, I
Exactly.
want to do something totally different. So by
Exactly.
telling these stories in that way, that allows us to see how that can really be true.
Oh, yes. And I show because, that was true of even me growing up in my own family. And again, observing, cousins and aunts and uncles. And the thing is, there's so many factors. It's like, your DNA, right? Obviously, your lineage, but then your direct parents or your caretakers, whoever's raising you. Your birth order is so important. Whether you're the firstborn, the secondborn, that middle child, the last child, whatever it might be, your gender, right? So many things factor into like what shapes you and your personality and what you decide to do with your life. And sometimes, like when I say decide what to do with your life, like sometimes the choices are limited. Our people aren't even aware of the many options that they might have, right?
That's true. That's true. um Well, you had something that you want to share. Please share
Yes.
with us, and then we can have a few more questions for you. But I'd love to just have you share something so we can see how well the book is written and hear one of the characters' stories.
Sure. And I'll just emphasize that, the book also, in addition to being multi-voice, it's written in different voices in other ways. So I write in standard English. I also write in dialect. And then there's present tense, past tense. It's like it's a hodgepodge of everything. There's the first person perspective, there's second person, third person, there's a little bit of everything going on. So I wanted to read a little bit from section from inspired by one of my great grandparents, and my great grandmother, when she comes up to New Jersey and sees her husband, who's no longer the country bumpkin that she left, or who left her in Alabama. Okay, and this is in the second person and dialect. The Jim you found in New Jersey wasn't the same man who left Alabama. When you got to the Pennsylvania station in Newark, you ain't recognize him until he took off his bowler hat and waved it at you and the children. Gone was the overalls, the ill-fitting gray church jacket, the unruly puff of hair like his pappy's. He wore a tailored pinstripe suit that highlighted the honey color of his eyes. The jacket was flipped open to show off a watch chain dangling from his vest pocket. His slick back hair reflected the sunlight just as much as his shoes. He leaned against his cart, hitched to a horse, which you later learned he'd borrowed from his brother. You noticed colored and white ladies alike seeking glances as they passed, and your chest puffed out. For the first time, you realized what all them girls back in Houston County, Alabama used to see in them. Just as quick, fear prickled your stomach. Suddenly, you realized you never made much of Jim's look before because you hoped if you ignored him, white men might not notice Jim's effect on they women either. Then you remembered you was in the North. Couldn't nobody bother Jim. He could live a long life, unlike your ma's husbands, and so could your son Jebby. But when you got up close to Jim, the dark half moons beneath his eyes gave you pause. That night in bed, Jim held you closer than he ever done and put his nose in your hair and told you he missed that smell, how it reminded him of down home. You snickered out of discomfort and drew your head away. What, Jim? You mean to tell me you miss it back there? He sighed. I got more stuff up here, more money than I ever had, 3 suits and 3 pairs of shoes, a watch. I found us this house. I've been going to see a picture show about every month, but I ain't been happy up here, Celia. You was silent, thinking of that house whose rooms the children galloped through, hooting and hollering soon's they entered. You ain't even yell at them to hush and mind their manners, 'cause you wanted to cry out yourself. The house was in the short, quiet street called Waldorf, named after some fancy hotel in New York City, Jim said. The structure was narrow but spacious, with a bedroom for you and Jim and a separate one for the children, gas lighting, a pot-belly stove, a whole room apart from the kitchen just for dining, a parlor, and three floors counting the basement where there was a toilet that flushed. The children's elementary school was a half-mile away, so they could walk there without worrying about heat stroke or blisters. And you couldn't get over how friendly, how normal acting the white folks was. The ones across the street even said welcome to you and offered you some type of sweet tasting bread. What was there to be long-faced about? These jobs, Jim continued, they wasn't nothing but a ruse to get us colored men coming up here. We ain't nothing but fill-ins for crackers who don't show up for work when they get sick or go on strike. You know what my longest position was, Celia? 3 months. Some of the time is just a few days. And what's going to happen if I get sick? Y'all found out that winter.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that. That just tells us a lot. And even as I was reading the book, it made me think about how, of course, people left the South for obvious reasons, the things that were happening to them openly, but to realize that going up north wasn't necessarily the promised land that they might have thought it was going to be.
No, because, when I factored in that, Black women were still domestics, first of all, a lot of the men might have gotten the factory jobs, immediately coming up, especially during that first wave of the Great Migration, so the pay would have been better. Like Jim is saying, the pay is better. I can go to the movies. It's not segregated. I have to sit here. I don't have to step off the sidewalk, for white folks to pass, at least in some places.
Right.
Because we know in the North, there are cities like Chicago, for example, which are still, even today, still massively segregated. But at the same time, it just really hit me hard that, okay, like everybody in my great grandmother's generations, at least in my family, they were domestic workers, and that's like they couldn't get any other work to do, or laundry. And then their children, for the most part, worked in factories, right? So these weren't the quote educated Black folks, right? They weren't the upwardly mobile, in the sororities and fraternity, because they didn't go to college, right? They barely finished high school, so the opportunities education wise were still limited for them. And of course, if they didn't have those good jobs with the good pay, then in terms of home ownership, land ownership, things like that, that would have been difficult for them as well. Not to mention, obviously, you come up to the present day, right? And like I said, you still have the police brutality going on. You still have people dying early at the hands of the law enforcement. You have mass incarceration, which in a lot of cases looks very similar to, the sharecropping and even some slavery situations that happened in the past, right? So, and also the thing is, my family, they went to the New Jersey suburbs. So they didn't go to Harlem. They didn't go to Detroit. They didn't go to the major big cities, and so I would even say that the people who did go to the big cities sometimes even had it worse because, they're living in these super crowded, super dirty, conditions where there's, massive amounts of poverty. And then, of course, drugs are coming in and the violence and all that kind of stuff, happening. And, segregation also happening in the North, redlining, people being restricted to where they can live, where they can actually buy homes, even if they get the wealth to buy the homes. So white flight is happening, right? So yeah, just looking at the North, it wasn't quite the promised land.
No, it definitely wasn't. It really wasn't. I'm from Ohio, so same thing, Cleveland, people would go to Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, places like that. And then over time, of course, we know now, what used to be considered areas that used to be considered really profitable or booming, a lot of those towns are dying when it comes to the industry, or have died when it comes to the industry. So it definitely is something to see that, and to, to think at one point those were the places to go, but now things have changed so much over time.
And are more segregated probably now than they ever were.
And that is so true. Now, one of the things, of course, these are the things that were happening around them, but then, of course, there were the things that were happening within the families. One of the things that really stood out to me were a couple of the relationships between, like, the mothers and their children,
Yes.
and how daughters were often being raised
Yes.
versus how sons were being raised.
Yeah, so that's very evident even from the first section, right? So yeah, I definitely wanted to emphasize those gender differences because again, I saw that growing up, myself, and so yeah, even down to like who gets to go to school in the South, like when you're farming and you can only go to school even part of the year, around the harvest season and everything. But in the case of my family, I envisioned that the boys, were the ones who got to go to school first. And I mean, you can say like, okay, well, it's practical, right? Because at that time, the opportunities were more limited for girls, right? I mean, they still are, but they're more limited. So people were betting to get the boys educated because they could actually advance further. But even there, you just see that there's a difference in terms of gender dynamics. And then that's emphasized with another great grandmother because I was wondering why she basically kept her son so close to her, to the extent that she separated him from his wife. And so I basically went back into her childhood and envisioned, I knew that she did have a brother. And I knew that it was just a random note that I found in my family's papers that he basically died on a chain gang, that there was a fire or something on a chain gang. And so I envisioned that this didn't start with her son, right? That it had to come from somewhere else. And so it came, she had that experience with her brother, her young brother, seeing her mother coddling her brother. But also, where did that come from? Right. And it comes out her mother was born a slave. Her son is living in Jim Crow South. And this is someone who you can say legitimately is scared about her son's safety, so she's definitely being very overprotective of him, and this is a narrative that I think we don't necessarily hear often. We more hear the other side where it's like, especially with Black males, getting like basically abused physically by their parents, because it's like, okay, if you can't take the abuse, if you can't take, being hit, being beaten, being humiliated, what will happen to you when you go out in the streets and the white person does that to you? If you fight back, you resist, you'll die. Right. So we need to toughen you up so that you can withstand that. And there is a character in the book who also, says that about her children, like, you have to be tough to survive as a Black person. So, who cares if you get little to eat, right? So I show, a little bit of everything alongside that.
Right. It just really stood out to me because thinking of the times, of course, and I mean, and even in present day, there are a lot of things that our young men or older men, Black men face and deal with in society, and we know that. But then it kind of bothers me. I'm be honest, not your book, it's what I know happens in the world.
Yes. Yes.
It's like we have to protect our sons at all costs, but as women, as girls, as females, we are vulnerable as well in different.
Exactly. And we're also facing, we're also dealing with the anger and brutalization that our Black men are putting on us, which I also make clear, because the section that I read there from the book about Jim, you basically see him take out that anger that he's facing on his wife and on his son also, but on his children. So I definitely wanted to show that, like, there's a chain, right? It's a chain, and if we focus, like, yes, so yes, Black men might have it worse in terms of like society, but then when they come home, who gets it? Who
Right.
gets it? Who
Right.
receives?
Right,
Right.
right. I mean, that's true. So, a friend of mine, and I was having that conversation this weekend because someone else that we know made a comment about, "Oh, I don't want to fight anymore. I want the men to fight. Our men to fight for us." And I'm like, that sounds good in theory, but sometimes that's not going to happen for a variety of reasons. They may not fight for us, or we may have to end up, battling them. So, and this is not to
Exactly.
disparage men by any cost. I love Black men. These are just the realities of
Yes.
life. And like you said, if people are in positions as many of the characters in this book, the male characters, where they were dealing with things on the outside, and because they, nobody was going to therapy.
Oh.
Nobody,
And still not today.
right, right. But it's like, so yeah, they're going to drink too much. They're going to chase women. They're going to beat the woman that they have.
Exactly.
They're going to act out in some sort of way that isn't necessarily healthy.
Yes. And with that, because I don't hate Black men, and the thing is, like, I know, like, having read so much literature by Black women over the years and knowing that there's certain books that come out and all of a sudden it's like, she hates Black men. And, I don't. And there are Black men in the book who are not, hateful and like abusive and all of that kind of stuff. So I wanted to show that balance, of that not everyone's all one way as well.
Right, right. Another thing that was really interesting is the dynamic between thinking of Celia and Lucy, because we kind of start with them, and at the beginning they've come up to New Jersey together, they have this friendship, they live in the same community and they're really close, and then over time how it falls apart.
Yes.
Even though you would think that they would continue to, have that relationship, how it starts to fall apart, and just the dynamics of things like that, and how it can take one thing that can, destroy relationships or even families just from one fallout. So, I mean, I know things are fictionalized, but we know that, some of these things happen, but has there ever been a reconciliation between the two families, or it's still kind of...
Yeah, between the families, yes, indeed, but not between the women
Mhm,
and not between Bertha and her mother, Lucy.
mhm,
And in fact, I have been writing another section in the book because I thought that there was, based on some of the research the documentation that I was finding, I thought that they not necessarily reconcile, but that they at least communicated. And my mother was like, no, they never really talked to each
mhm.
other ever again. And I was like, oh my God, like, and it was just so heartbreaking, to find that out. And so the thing is, like, that's where like the truth comes in, because I really wanted to stick, as close to the truth, at least the truths that I were given by hearsay. I wanted to stick to that because, I mean, ultimately, I wanted to really know what my family's motivations were. So it was like kind of like detective work, writing these narratives and trying to figure out their psychology, their motivations, and all that kind of stuff. And so, and even with Celia and Lucy, I don't know exactly, what it was that made them. I know definitely the something happened. Well, the marriage, the pregnancy and the marriage between their children. That's when they went their separate ways. Because I didn't find out that they were friends until I was an adult,
Oh,
and
wow.
and it shocked me. I was just like, what? They were friends? Like, how is that possible? Right. And so again, it's just like these mind blowing things. Like, how is it possible for, a woman? So your mother, you have a daughter, and her mother-in-law physically kicks her out of the house, potentially makes her have a miscarriage, doesn't let her raise her children anymore. How is it that you are friends with that woman?
Mhm.
Right.
Right,
How?
yeah. What
And
happened?
so,
Yeah.
like, why? And so I really wanted to explore, like, how could she have been her friend? How could she still have some type of loyalty to this person who brutalized your daughter? What is your relationship to your daughter? that you would be friends with someone like that. So that's where that kind of thinking came in, to really explore the complexity of it.
One of the other things that I thought about in the book is religion, the place that religion plays as well, and how a person may be of one type of religion or another, and how oftentimes that played a factor in behaviors.
Yes. Yeah, so Lucy, who's based on my great grandmother, one of my great grandmothers, is very religious, I was told, and so she's someone who tries to lean into her religion, but then you see that there are complications with that, right? Because even she is doubting of that religion, at certain moments in her life. And then her friend, Celia, is also supposedly, on the surface, very religious too, so Lucy was, I guess, not Baptist, but I think AME. I think she followed AME. And then Celia basically becomes a Jehovah's Witness, right? Which is a very specific thing. Right. But this is also someone whose favorite word was goddamn.
Right.
So so I just like oh my God, I just like how messy and complex people are, right? And how hypocritical people can be. I like all of that messiness, because to me that creates, they were interesting people, but then they also obviously make for interesting characters and character studies, right? And then Bertha, Lucy's daughter, she flirts with hoodoo, because she's already tried religion. She's tried the Christian church and seen that that's not really doing anything for her. So she delves into hoodoo, which has African roots, to try to, and it works for her, or at least she thinks it works for her. Right. So yeah, I wanted to definitely look at religion and people's, and then, different perspectives towards it.
Right, because that's the thing. A lot of times people make assumptions about, where Black people land.
Oh,
The
yes.
reality of it is throughout time, throughout history.
Yes.
Of course, we know when we came here our ancestors were brought here. They weren't necessarily Christian per se. So yes, and over time, people
some of them were even Muslim. Right.
Yes,
some
a lot of those countries are Muslim countries and still are. So it's just the fact that there are differences, and we're not just like with a lot of other things. We're not a monolith, and it shows up in different ways.
Yes.
So that was something. Just thinking about families and how even amongst the children, how each one, I'm thinking of Bertha's children, for example, each one of them just chose different paths and did things differently as they went through life. Some chose to, go and be, what should I say, bougie or whatever.
Yes.
Military, all these different sorts of things. How was it in you researching to try to figure out what they did, or were these things that were well known, or how did that all come together in piecing that part of the story?
Well, I grew up, I knew my grandmother, I knew her sisters. So I never met either of my great grandmothers. They died before I was born, but I knew my grandfather. And I knew, so I knew even some of my grandparents, like sisters and brothers, right? And so we used to gather for holidays, 4th of July especially, and that's where all the stories would come out, Christmas, Thanksgiving, all of that. And so so I knew these people as adults. I knew my aunts and uncles, my mother's cousins, so I knew who they were and what they did, and even the ways they talked, right? Because my grandmother and them, they had a thick Alabama accent. Really thick Alabama accent. So in fact, through my research, I discovered that I had cousins in Chicago who were related on another branch. And when I met them, because they actually came up to Chicago during the second wave of the Great Migration, which was like in the 50s, after World War II, basically. And so they still had that saying, like, as soon as they opened my mouth, I was like, oh my God, like that's how my grandma and, all that used to speak. Right. But my my mother's generation, like they all had Jersey accents, right? So I, as a child being like super observant, super imaginative, like I've just absorbed all of those things. And so that was something that I knew going in. But I did have to, where the research was helpful, especially I think looking at the census records, in the South. And one thing that was like, that struck me was realizing how young kids were when they started out working in the fields, which is why that, I emphasize that work from the very beginning in that very first section. Because I think like maybe like as young as 7, you'd already see like the kids being listed as farmhands, right? And just thinking again, also with slavery, like when you were enslaved, you didn't really have much of a childhood because by a certain point you were already expected to work, even if it was like, okay, you're the ones doing the weeding and you're bringing the water to the adults, but you're still working.
Right, right, right. Now, from the perspective of like doing the genealogy and the research, how long was the process for you? Because you said you had been working on the stories and things like that over the years. So just to like do the research and, pull artifacts, all those sorts of things. What was that process like, or how long did that take in the building and the creation of the book?
Well, I mean, I started the genealogical research like 20 plus years ago, like when I was finishing college. But the thing is, I wasn't like, I'm doing this research to write a book about my family. I was just doing the research just because it was fun. Like, I didn't even think I would find anything on my family, honestly, because again, they were poor, they weren't quote educated, they didn't do anything special with their lives, even they thought the same thing. Now there's a whole book about them. But and so like I just went to the National Archives because this is before all the ancestry.com. Ancestry was on a CD-ROM back then.
Oh, wow.
Nothing was digitized. You had to actually go to a repository somewhere and like hand scroll through microfilm machines. And so like I just thought that my people wouldn't even be there because I was like, well, why would the government care about them? And then knowing my family, they probably like the census record came, don't say nothing, don't tell them nothing. And so the very first census I found, I like screamed in the middle of the research room, and like the guy next to me like I'm like, my family, I'm just like going, my family is there, my family is there. And it was just like, I just got the bug I call it the genealogy bug. And I was like, wait, they're there? And I'm looking at all these like file cabinets. Of course, like, again, this is like the physical repository where they have all the documents, even the original census ledgers, the handwritten ledgers that are like huge, books. But I'm looking at all these file cabinets like, oh my God, where else is my family? Where else is my family? And so I just like started doing the research. And so that was just like fun. It was like playing detective, through history and like, because you find like common names, for example. And okay, well, is this John Smith? You're John Smith.
Right.
And like figuring out all the details. So that was just like my hobby and fun, so it took a long time. It took, more than 2 decades, but it didn't necessarily take a long time. The writing was not easy emotionally. I talk about the section where my mother, based on the story about my mother and her siblings and cousins, where they plotted to kill Celia, who was their grandmother, because she treated them so poorly. It took me 4 years to finish that because I just kept crying. It was so emotional. I just kept crying that I couldn't even get past page 2 for 4 years. But at the same time, once I did get over that emotional hump, like the story came out in like a day. So yeah, so it's really hard to put like a number on it because I was also working on other manuscripts, during the whole time that I was writing this.
Yes, that's something just to think, because I can imagine the emotion of it all. Because if you sit back and you think about what people may, we can hypothesize about what our people might have gone through, but to have actual story or actual proof of certain things that they've gone through, I can imagine that many times that was a heavy emotional lift for you.
Yes. And also to see, like, again, thinking about the present day, because I'm dealing with my own stuff, in the present day. I'm dealing with macroaggressions, microaggressions, in my life and my work, and just living as a Black woman in this world. And so that happening at the same time, and then I was still working. I had decided in 2019 that I would work on this book, that I would finish this book, because I've been working on another one about the slave trade for many, many years. And so I switched over to this one because I was like, okay, it's almost done. I think I can get this done relatively quickly. And then the pandemic strikes. And I was just like, oh my God, there's no way. Like, I stopped writing for 6 months, because I was just too depressed. I was like, I live alone. I feel, even more isolated than I already did. I can't see anybody. I can't touch anybody. Like, it's just like this unreal, unnatural situation. And now I have to write these stories about my family, where I'm dredging up these really dark, heavy emotions. I'm like, no way, no way. So I stopped writing, for a long time. And then, at the same time, there's all these like murders happening of Black people, and then George Floyd. And I'm just like, no way, I can't focus on this, but eventually I was able to get it done. I had a friend in particular who came to see me and was like, you're going to finish this thing. You're almost done. You're going to finish. I was like, no, but I see myself collapsing like right before the finish line. I see it, but I just can't. And she's like, no, you're going to get this done. So having friends like that over the years just pushed me. That really helped.
Well, that's good. It's good to have the right people in your corner.
Yes.
That's so important. That's so important. So for people who may be thinking about diving into their family history, whether it's to write a book, which you say you didn't necessarily intend to do that initially or not, what types of suggestions would you give to them, and just in pulling these stories together and using them to kind of inform where you're going as you move forward?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing that I have to tell people is just to talk to your relatives. And if you can talk to the oldest people alive that you know of, it's really essential. Write down what they say, ask their permission, obviously, but write down, or write it later, but write down, record. Because the thing is, and even when people are, experiencing dementia, you just never know what they might remember, and what information might be valuable or not, right? And so in my family, like, we have one person in particular who's mentioned in the book, or inspired a character in the book, who is known as a family liar, right? Don't listen to anything she says. She lies, she lies, she lies. Mm-hmm. And, to this day, like, just about everything that she told me, I've been able to verify in the records. There's like 2 or 3 things that she said, I'm like, nah, he wasn't pure Indian. He had an afro. Right. But everything else that she told me, I was able to like verify in the records, right? And if I had discounted that and said, oh, she lies, she makes up things, she doesn't know what she's talking about, it would have just been lost, right? So that's the big thing I can tell people, just talk to people. And then someone, after my book launch, someone came up to me and they're like, well, what if the person is really evil? What do you do in that situation? And I was like, well, first of all, I would hope that reading my book, that you would change that perspective, that no one is evil. Like, people do evil things, but right. Is there someone who's really evil? There might be 1 or 2 that I can think of, but is anyone genuinely evil? Right. Because again, where does that come from? Whether people have things that happen to them, or things in their brains that are, not functioning the way that they probably should be, and so if you're already thinking of someone as evil, if you're going to talk to them, that energy is there with you, and that might be a block, or might, put them at a distance, and then I would just emphasize, like, if there's someone who can harm you still in the present day, whether that's like physically, emotionally, that's probably also not the person that you want to talk to. So I'm not saying do that. Right. But if you're already thinking of someone as like, oh, this is, someone who's bad, et cetera, et cetera. You just want to be like open and curious, just curious. Oh, tell me more about XYZ. Even if it's something that might feel disturbing, like, okay, because you might learn something in that, but don't do it to the extent where you're risking your own safety and crossing boundaries that you're not comfortable with.
Right. Yes, because you was thinking about that. I was thinking of a person. Yeah, I don't know about.
Yeah.
Or talk to that person and ask questions, but then
Or get someone else
right.
who's neutral, a neutral party, to go to them and ask questions, because again, that person might have some valuable information, that you never know how it might help you later. So like one of my aunts in particular, I was able to talk to her just a couple months before she passed away, and she's one of the main people who was like, I ain't never done nothing special with my life, like, why do you want to talk to me, I was nobody, blah blah blah. And I was just like, whatever. And I was like, well, just tell me, how did you grow up? Because can you just tell me a story? Like, what did you watch on TV? Did you watch TV? Like, what games did you play? What songs did you sing? What music did you? And then we were on the phone for 2 hours talking. Right. And then it came out that my grandfather abused I didn't even know that story. And I was like, what? He did what? Because that wasn't my child image of my grandfather. He was not an abuser or an abuser, right? He didn't abuse. And so like learning about all of that. But she also told me some genealogical information about her mother, names in particular, and like locations. And then no one else in the family either had that or remembered that information. So I still haven't been able to get more, but I still, I wrote that down just in case, records might become available. So yeah, talking to people, I would say, is the key thing, because, the genealogy, like, it's so easy nowadays. You can find, tutorials. I mean, you can literally just Google someone's name and records will come up, and a lot of the stuff is available for free. It's been digitized. But if you don't talk to people and you don't have the names to begin with, and that person dies and they had all that information and it's not written down anywhere, it's going to be really that much harder to find.
Mm-hmm. Now, the house on Coleman Hill.
Yes.
There was a point where you went to the home and you were able to retrieve documents and things like that, which was
Yes.
a blessing that you were able to do that.
Oh my God. Yes.
Often things get lost.
Yes. Or thrown away.
Thrown away. I think that's great that you were able to do that.
Yes.
And it just inspired me, or wanted to bring that up, because even in the here and now, if there are things that we can get a hold of,
Yes.
a Bible, photos, whatever it is, that, I mean, it may not tell all of the story, but it's going to give you a lot more than what you might have otherwise.
I mean, just so many things. I have photos of my great great grandparents, both of whom were born slaves, right? And so, especially when those people want to say slavery was so long ago, I have pictures of my ancestors who were born slaves, right? And one of them has a picture of my great great grandfather's hands. And I'm just thinking, like, these are the hands that were not free. When he was a little boy, he could not use these hands to write, because it would have been illegal for him, and so like, so to have those pictures, even, like, to me, that's more valuable than having gold, or like, because there's some people, like, obviously they think of the family heirlooms, like, oh, I need the jewelry and the money and the property, and all that's really important too, right? Because that's part of the wealth, the intergenerational wealth. But there's certain things that you can't even really place a value on.
Right. So at one point in time, your children are going to get to read this story. What is the main thing that you would want for them to take away from it?
I'm just hoping that, for the future generations, that they don't end up repeating, these toxic cycles, that it stops, right? That they recognize it for what it is and that it stops. And this just goes beyond my family. It's not just me, it's other people as well, because there are other people who can't recognize why certain people are like that in their families, right? or they think again that someone's evil and they're like, oh, I don't know why. I don't know why. Well, maybe this can give you some more understanding of why that person, you don't have to like the person. You don't have
Right.
to love the person. You don't have to make up with the person, be there, but you can have more understanding of why they're like that and maybe start to change something for the next generation.
Right. And I think that's so important because some people talk about the generational trauma or generational,
Mm-hmm.
curses, but what about the generational blessings? And sometimes
Yes,
you have to
yes,
sort through those things that may not have been positive to be able to get to and discover where you can find the light. So
exactly.
I can appreciate that. So, of course, you are busy on a busy schedule with showing up in lots of different places to have conversations about Coleman Hill.
Yes.
So, Kim, where are some places where people can look for you in the days and weeks ahead?
Yes, so actually this week I will be in the DC area. I have reading in Bethesda, Baltimore. Next week I will be in Boston, Exeter, New Hampshire, Provincetown, and Cape Cod. And then next month I'll be in Chicago because I have a huge, I lived in Chicago for 4 years. I got my MFA there in Chicago. I'll also be in Charlottesville, Virginia, and back in New York City, New Jersey, forgetting New Jersey. I have a
Jersey.
couple events coming up here, right here in Jersey, including in Essex County, some literary festivals as well. Yes.
All right. Well,
And
that's
then people can go to my website and find the full schedule. And there's more being added even as we speak. So, if you don't see your city or location or someplace nearby, just keep checking back.
all right. And last thing now, of course, and all of Kim's places where you can find her, both Facebook on, well, I say X/Twitter, and her website are all listed there for you to see where you can follow and keep up with her. And I know usually when an author writes and is promoting a book, there's something else coming. So is there something we can be on the lookout for in the next year or so?
Yeah, so my next book is slated to be published in two years from now. And this is a book actually that I worked on for many, many years, but it's looking at the slave trade in West Africa, Ghana in particular. And it takes place in the 18th century and also present day. It goes back and forth between the two. And it looks at women's perspectives of the slave trade. Nowadays, people are familiar with that kind of history through Homegoing, Jesse's novel that came out a couple of years ago. But like I've been working on this for years and years and years, where I was just trying to explain to people what a slave castle was, and
Right.
the fact that African people, there was a whole story before they even got on the slave ships, and that was getting captured, and not everyone was on the coast, so getting captured in the interior and being marched to the coast, and not everyone made it even on that march or on the raids that happened in their villages and homes. And so in focusing on the Dutch as well, because here, especially in the United States, we keep hearing about the British, and not realizing that other European nations were involved in the slave trade. So the Dutch were heavily involved in the slave trade, so talking about that experience as well.
All right, well, we will be on the lookout for it because it is important to know these stories and just to know where we come from and be able to pay honor and homage to those who came before us. We have one last comment that we will end on. This one from Rachel. Really enjoyed the audio narrators, and the story reminded me of the journey and experiences of so many relatives in my family tree. Great interview. Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate you. Yes, and it definitely put in mind several things for me, especially since I was just in Alabama and was thinking about,
Yes.
all the stuff about Alabama, and who knows, we could be distant cousins. You never know.
Oh, you know what genealogy taught me, and especially DNA genealogy, and it's obvious, but I think we have to still put it out there because, we have all these superficial divisions that we've created as human beings. We're all cousins.
Hmm. Hmm.
We're all descendant from, even if you believe, I mean, there are people who believe in the Adam and Eve, right?
Right.
But then want to say that we're all different being, species practically, but we're
Right.
all cousins.
We're all
We're all
cousins.
cousins.
We're all cousins. We're all
Some are just close, more close, closely related than others, but we're all
Right.
cousins. We're all related. We're all one big human family.
I know that's right. Thank you so much. So if you could hold on for me one moment, I just want to announce next week's book
Yes.
right quick, but don't hang up just yet. But thank you so much for being with us, Kim, and I appreciate you. And we look forward to, all of your future successes, your current successes, and hopefully this won't be the last time that you will join us in this space. So thank you. Thank you. All right. So, real quick, everybody, thank you for joining in on the conversation because I think it's a really powerful book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, please do because there's so much in it. And even though these stories are not your personal story per se, you can definitely learn something from it. Or as Kim said, be able to understand things that may have been happening in your own family and why people might be the way that they are. It's something to learn in that. So just for next week, want to let you know about the book. We will be talking to Jean Alicia Elster about her book, How It Happens. So that is next Monday, September 25th at 8 o'clock p.m. We will be here with Jean to talk about how it happens, and I'm looking forward to that. And then also in the next few days, I'll start announcing the books for October, which we've got some really knockout powerhouses planned for the month of October as well. So look forward to seeing you then. And until the next time, please have a great time. Go ahead and pick up Kim's book. And happy reading to each and every one of you. See you real soon. Bye-bye.